cognitive processes. In this chapter, we're going to talk about how knowledge is represented in the brain and how we store and organize information in long-term memory. So think about how you organize information about a dog. Um, a network model would say, well, you have information about a dog that he has paws, he has a tail, but then you also know that this dog is a mammal. And mammals have various characteristics. They breathe air, they have live young. But you also then know specific things about specific kinds of dogs. Like if you're looking at a Bernese Mountain Dog, that is the favorite dog breed of the writer of your textbook, then you know that they have black and white and rust colored fur, and their exuberant disposition is a key characteristic of that type of dog breed. And so the idea behind these network models is that you have this information stored in your mind and you rely on cognitive economy. In other words, facts and properties are stored at the highest appropriate level and assumed to be true for all lower nodes. So think about mammal being the highest level, and then dog being below that, and then the particular type of dog being below that. So if you ask a question of a research subject, like, does a dog have live young? That would require us to travel up the network to the mammal level to answer the to answer the question, because that's where the information is stored. And then if you ask the research subject another question like, does a dog have a tail? That can be answered more quickly because that's stored at the dog node. So in other words, the amount of time you travel through the network, so more movement through the network from dog to mammal to live young, then the response time should be longer. But if you don't have to travel as far in the network, then the response time should be shorter for a question. So in other words, in research studies, that's how you would suggest that this is how knowledge is organized in your mind. Now, a hierarchical semantic network might look something like this, that you would have things like animals and characteristics of animals, that they have skin, can move around, they eat, they breathe. But then you have various kinds of animals like birds and fish. You have stored information about those sorts of characteristics. And then you have different kinds of animals that belong to the bird category, like canaries and ostriches, or in the fish category, salmon and sharks. And they all have characteristics like sharks can bite and are dangerous, but salmon are pink, that sort of thing. Canaries can sing, whereas ostriches can't fly. And so for some sorts of things, this makes sense, doesn't it? But there are some, challenges with thinking about all things being organized this way in your mind. And the first challenge comes from research studies that where you ask people to just verify information, like asking people to answer the question, does a shark is it able to move? And they can answer that as quickly as a fish can that fish move. So you think, well, if the knowledge is stored this way in this hierarchy, then the response times for those two types of questions should be different, because you have one question that requires you to move more longer distances in this network, whereas the other kind of question, the information is stored closer together. So, is information being stored this way? Also, people can verify things like a pig is an animal faster than a pig is a mammal. So then that's really confusing, because that information is reverse what you would expect. You would expect that, people can verify a pig is a mammal because those two things are closer in the network. But in fact, when you look at the pattern of data, the person is doing the opposite. Okay, and then you have the typicality effect, where people can verify that, certain things that are typical of a category, they're identified faster than other atypical items. So, a canary is a typical bird, whereas a turkey is atypical, and people, rely on this typicality effect. And that doesn't really make sense with this network as is, um, as well. So, a couple of different challenges for thinking about information stored in this way. So researchers came up with other ideas. They thought, well, you know what? Maybe you just have more of a looser structure. You have these concepts and then you have connections to them. So, for example, you have, the colors all connected to each other, but then you have flowers. The types of flowers are connected to the colors. And then when people are using this information, there's spreading activation that connects these concepts. There's also variations of these models where they take into effect things that we've talked about before. So the ACT models, or the adaptive control of thought models, integrate what we've talked about before: declarative memory, working memory, and procedural memory. So these three types of memory systems are built into this model, where you have declarative memory, which is, declaring facts, like what's a vehicle? That's declarative memory. And then you have working memory. That's the information that's currently at a high level of activation because you're working on it. So if you see a car passing by, declarative memory would tell you that's a vehicle because you know that belongs to the category of vehicles. But then your working memory might say, oh, that's like a red Toyota Camry, and you are working on that information because you see that car, and someone asks you if you saw a red car on the road or something like that. And then procedural memory, of course, is the memory to be able to do things like to actually drive the car, the skills that maybe you don't need language for, to do these tasks. So incorporating these other things that we've talked about before into this idea of understanding knowledge. And then we have these connectionist models. These are the models that can learn concepts through experience. And this is the exciting research that was the beginnings of artificial intelligence. And we'll talk about that more in this course. But think about how we learn these various concepts. How does that happen? And can a computer do that just like we do that? If so, how does that happen? So these models learn to develop patterns of activation through many trials with training examples. And so what you will have is you're training a computer from scratch to learn what is a canary or what is a vehicle, or those kinds of things. And so you give the computer model training examples, and then the model learns what initial connections that are set at random to start with, which ones should be adjusted. Is a wheel connected to vehicle, but a wing is connected to canary, that sort of thing. So with each new trial, weights are adjusted stronger or weaker when they are exposed to these training examples. So if you present a wheel, then the wheel is going to get, the connection between wheel and vehicle will get stronger, but the connection between wheel and canary will get weaker, right? And vice versa, for wing and canary should get stronger, and wing and vehicle should get weaker, right? Okay, so you see how this would work. So this is kind of a crazy schematic from your textbook, but it gives you the idea of how this connectionist model would work. So you have all these different things that could be connected, like living thing, plant, animal, tree, flower. And so then you have robin as a bird, and then the network will learn what connects to a robin. A robin can grow, a robin can move, a robin can fly. All of those things get connected to these various layers, and there's like hidden layers that connect all of these concepts together, and then you just provide training examples until the connectionist model learns. So think about now concepts and categories. So concepts are a mental representation of some object, event, or pattern. So we previously were just talking about categorizing objects, dogs and birds and things like that. But now we think about concepts. We can also have a concept of an event, like what is a birthday party, or a pattern of things. And a category is a class of similar things that can be objects or entities and share some similarity and properties. So our brain can do all of this. So let's dive deep into this a little bit more. So think about concepts. So it's not just like the characteristics of a bird, but you can have concepts that seem to be difficult to pin down, but obviously our brain can do it. So think about what is a triangle or what is a bachelor. Like a bachelor is a difficult pin down concept, but you have characteristics or features. Like a bachelor is male, adult, unmarried, and human. A triangle is a planar figure, it's a closed geometric figure, and it has three sides. So obviously we have various, you know, uh, characteristics or features that are tied to every concept. So the classical view of concepts is that concepts are stored as a set of features that are necessary and sufficient to be a member of the concept. So just like I gave the example of a bachelor. However, again, there's problems with this sort of view, like typicality effects that I mentioned before. Not all examples of a concept are equally good. And then oftentimes we have disagreements on category membership. People don't always agree from person to person on a category. And then a lot of times people know what a concept is. You ask them and they're like, of course. But then when you ask them to generate a list of features, it's really difficult. Like they have a really hard time doing it. And so if the features are what are being used to decide on a concept, shouldn't we be able to generate those features fairly easily? You would think so, but people don't tend to do it very easily. So let's think about now prototypes and exemplars. So first of all, prototypes. If you have a concept, then perhaps you have a prototype, an idealized representation of a category. And if that's true, then family resemblance is key. So if you have a person, then you think about, okay, well, they look like their family members. That's kind of like the underlying idea of a prototype. If you have a bird, then the best example of a bird, the most typical bird is used as the prototype. When something comes into a person's view and they're not familiar with it, they would refer back to this idealized prototype to make the judgment if something belongs in a category or not. A different approach is an exemplar approach, and that's the idea that every time you come in contact with a concept, you learn about this new instance, and then when you do that, then you compare it to all your previously stored instances or exemplars. And it does not require necessary and sufficient features of a concept to be considered in the category. In other words, your personal experiences experiencing something are really what matters. So if you had a Cavalier, which is the little dog in the left picture, a Cavalier King Charles as your dog growing up, then you would think of that as the dog that you refer to when you come in contact with another object. Whereas if you had a German Shepherd, the big dog in the left picture, then you would think of that as your dog when you're categorizing. So if you're a young child and you come across a rabbit for the first time, the rabbit looks so much more similar to the Cavalier that if the child's version of exemplar of a dog is the Cavalier, then the child might call the rabbit a dog. But if the child's dog is actually the German Shepherd, it might be too different. And so then the child would say, oh, that's not a dog. So you see how your personal experiences of interacting with concepts is critical to the exemplar view. Whereas the prototype view would say, no, no, the person has this average of all this information in their brain and they're using that to generate concepts. So the prototype view would take the Cavalier and the golden or the German Shepherd and all these other dogs and then merge it into like a most typical dog, and then that would be used to compare to the rabbit. So when do we store information about individual exemplars? We're probably likely to store such information when the task requires us to distinguish among individual instances. We're likely to store such information when the same instance appears repeatedly. We're likely to store information about exemplars when things vary in many complicated ways and the relevant dimensions are not obvious. When instances may belong to a number of categories at the same time, we're more likely to store exemplar information. Think about this like a physician who comes across all these different like nuanced things. They really could have this disease belongs to this category and this disease belongs to another category. So they store the individual instances because they're so similar. And then in natural settings, we probably store exemplar information, because we don't know when we're going to be asked to be called upon to use it later. Okay, schemata and scripts. So think about now expanding this idea further. Schema is large units of organized information used for representing concepts, situations, and events. Think about, 4th of July. How would you, talk about that event? So you would probably have a schema of what happens, like parades and fireworks and picnics and things like that. You also have scripts, which are schemas for routine events. Like think about going to eat at a restaurant. It allows us to make inferences about facts not stated. You go into a restaurant, you wait at the hostess stand to be asked to get seated at a table. Then you sit at a table and then you give your drink order. All of those steps are part of that script of what you would expect. And so this is not just about storing information, just about dogs and birds. This is all about like everything that you do in life. Probably, you're storing all that information about how you do things. So the knowledge-based view of concepts, a person classifying objects doesn't just compare features of objects to features stored in memory, and instead, a person uses his or her knowledge of how a concept is organized to justify the classification. So, it's not just that you are storing little object things in your head, but you do have this knowledge base that you can tap to make judgments and classifications and use that information. So this is an example to show you that we can do this in a fairly nuanced way. So look at this category: children, pets, photo albums, family, heirlooms, cash. What does it all belong to? I'm going to think about that for a second. Well, things you would try to save in the case of a fire, right? So this category makes great sense when you think about it in terms of that. But if you didn't have that information, then perhaps this category doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So we have probably three types of concepts. So we have the nominal kind concepts where there's more clear definitions. The example of what is a bachelor? What is a vehicle? Those are nominal kinds of concepts. And then we have natural kind concepts, things that occur naturally in some environment and may have more of a family resemblance or structure, like a tiger. And then we have artifact concepts that are constructed to accomplish a task and may be adequately described only within the knowledge-based approach, right? So, concepts can differ dramatically, and yet we can handle them all. We're pretty adept at it, right? So reviewing this chapter, what did we talk about? First, there are many different theories and frameworks about how knowledge is represented in memory and how we use knowledge. Second, network models assume that categories and facts are represented as linked nodes, and you can train these network models to learn this information. The ACT models also posit the existence of production rules to represent procedural memory. So how to do things can be put in here in these models. Similarity approaches to concept formation include the classical approach, the prototype view, the exemplar view, and parts of the schema view. And then explanation-based approaches include parts of these views and really allow us to do really complicated things. It's really kind of fascinating how we are able to just store so much information and use it and see the connections in various bits of information. And doing these experiments tells us how certain information is connected. And we saw that in this chapter, that you can test how these network models are organized and then see what humans actually do to see if it fits the model or not, or if the model is a close fit, but it needs to be modified a little bit. And that's the end of this chapter.